Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. There's a typical economic for wars in the traditional world that after a war happens, there's kind of an economic change that happens with it. Usually, the economy will go downhill for a little bit before it will kind of bounce back as, factories are retooled for post-war life, and farms that have been overproducing for the war era have a hard time getting that back. We don't really see that in the United States in the post-war era because the United States ends up helping so much of the rest of the world, and that's how we kick off our Unit 5 of the Roaring Twenties in Episode 1 of Post-War America. So, dear students, incline your ear and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delights. We have three objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to, number one, summarize the reactions to the perceived threats of communism and immigration. Two, describe some of the post-war conflicts between labor and management. And three, explain how urban culture clashed with the values of traditional rural society. But let's begin in Roman numeral number one. The World War I left Americans exhausted, and the debates over the League of Nations left them divided. And I often think that all of the wartime rhetoric, from the Committee of Public Information and all of the propaganda that surrounded it was really pretty exhausting to Americans. The progressive era had turned America upside down, and the social changes that result from it left Americans pretty socially unsettled. The post-war economy was also adjusting. By this point, cost of living had flat doubled, but farm and factory orders were down from wartime levels, and returning soldiers were coming home to reclaim their jobs from women and minorities, and farmers and factory workers suffered to find full employment. And two social philosophies emerge out of this controversy, quickly growing in public opinion. On one hand, you have nativism. Nativism is a prejudice against foreign-born people, and isolationism, the idea of pulling away from foreign affairs. Now, in our intro, I said that we don't really see that post-war correction in the United States. I should add a little asterisk to that and say we don't see it in the long run, but there is kind of a blip there in the middle. Maybe I should get that part straight. Subpoint B. Here I want to introduce a new term for us, one that'll get recycled a couple of times, but it's the first time we'll find it, and it's the proper definition of the term, the Red Scare. The term the Red Scare refers to a pretty short-lived period in American history after the Great War, and of a time of public opposition and fear of communist or anarchist infiltration into American society. Communism and anarchism are two different things. Communism is about a real strong government control, and anarchism is about no government control, but splitting those distinctions among people just didn't seem to be a worthwhile distinction to make. And they got rolled together in these fears of the Red Scare. Communism is an economic and political system that's run by a single-party government. The Communist Party is the only party that's allowed in this model of government. Communist governments are ruled by a dictator, and people have no private property. Everything that they own doesn't really belong to them, it belongs to the government. In 1919, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks set up a communist state in Russia. And at home, the United States also had a communist party. There it was formed and grew to 70,000 members. Now, anarchism, on the other hand, is a political belief that the government should be overthrown and that nothing should replace it. Though communism and anarchy are very different, they're very opposite of each other, fearful people tended to conflate those two ideologies in their head during the Red Scare. When several dozen bombs were mailed to government offices or business offices, people feared the Red Conspiracy to take over the government. Subpoint C. The fear of a communist takeover prompted the Attorney General. The Attorney General, even though his name is like attorney, really think of him as the head cop. He's the person in charge of the Department of Justice. Prompted the Attorney General Mitchell Palmer to go take action. He, along with J. Edgar Hoover, basically seated to go root out what was this, red menace that could be out there. They trampled civil rights, but ultimately, Palmer hunted down communists, socialists, and anarchists. They called it the Red Scare, and the raids trampled across civil rights, but ultimately failed to prove any real conspiracy. They didn't even find explosives or who was mailing these bombs to members of Congress. Some people might think that maybe this whole thing was just an attempt to go launch Mitchell Palmer's political career, but without ever really finding any evidence and nothing to build on, that flamed out too. Subpoint D. But in 1920, something else happened, and it was tied up in this question of the Red Scare, but also that nativist fear of being, opposed to foreigners. And in 1920, a shoemaker named Nicola Sacco and a fish peddler named Bartolomeo Vanzetti, they were both arrested and charged for the same crime of robbery and murder of a factory, killing a factory guard and a clerk. Both Sacco and Vanzetti had an unpopular opinion. They were anarchists and thought that government, should be overthrown and nothing replace it. Eyewitnesses to the robbery and murder, they didn't really have what you would call evidence. They said that the murderers, and here's a quote, looked Italian, which is not really evidence, right? But they said that they looked Italian. And Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian. Sacco and Vanzetti maintained their innocence. They provided alibis, and although the evidence against them was circumstantial at best, the jury nevertheless found them guilty and sentenced them to death. Protests in the United States immediately blew up, and in Europe and in Mexico. They demanded that Sacco and Vanzetti be set free. They claimed that these two were singled out for their unpopular political beliefs and their nationality, and because they're immigrants. Nevertheless, the execution was carried out in 1927. Now, in 1961, the case was reopened on this trial, and ballistics tests, brand new ballistics evidence, showed that Sacco's pistol was the one that fired that shot. However, there was no proof of who pulled the trigger. Subpoint E. Anti-immigration attitudes have been growing since the 1880s, when Southern and Eastern European immigrants began arriving in large numbers. These immigrants were willing to work for low wages in the mining and industry jobs. But after World War I, there was less demand for those works, and now immigrants seemed like they were excess population that were crowding up American job seekers. Nativists claimed that because there weren't so many unskilled jobs available, fewer immigrants were needed and were actually going to cause problems in the country. And so from 1919 to 1921, the number of immigrants was growing really fast. It grew by 600%. From 141,000 to 805,000 people. But under anti-immigrant pressures, Congress began to limit that immigration from European countries. And it sharply reduced immigration from Europe. And in 1924, European arrivals were cut even more sharply to just 2% of the number of residents in 1890. So it's 1924, but they look back at the year of 1890 and say, whatever the population was there, 2% of the people that are now coming in, that's the most that we can handle. And so, in particular, it established a new quota system, discriminating against Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans, saying, we'll only take so many, and once we've reached our quota, we're not taking any more. It prohibited Japanese immigration altogether, and it caused ill will between the United States and Japan. Quotas didn't seem to apply to the Western Hemisphere, though. Many Canadians and Mexicans entered pretty easily. Subpoint F. Active after the Civil War, but largely dominant since then, the Ku Klux Klan claimed in 1924 that they had grown to 4.5 million members. The Ku Klux Klan opposed black people and Catholics and Jews and immigrants, unions and saloons. The Klan controlled a lot of states' politics, and suddenly rose to prominence from being what was kind of an irrelevant club, if it even existed at all. Eventually, though, the violence associated with the Klan led to a drop in its social influence and power, but in some places it remained regionally important. Roman numeral number 2. During the Great War, the United States government didn't allow any strikes. If anybody wanted to go on strike, they would be subject to the work or fight provisions because it threatened the war effort. But after the war, those rules were lifted and strikes resumed. And in right away, like 3,000 different union strikes were called and 4 million strikers. And that's just in a single year. That's just in 1919. Employers were against strikes and they were against unions, and they labeled any strikers as communists. The idea of communism being to care for the working people, and here union members are like, we're working people and we want to go be cared for. Union members are not necessarily communists. I mean, it's a political belief. There might be some communists in unions, but it's not the same thing. However, in the popular imagination, union and communist became the same thing. Communism argues that workers, or the working class, should make the most money from their labor. Rather than the people that own the farms or own the factories, the people actually doing the job should be the ones to make all the money. Mainstream labor unions, they're not necessarily communist because one can argue for better wages or working conditions without wanting the government to go redistribute all the means of production. But there were a lot of union members particularly a group known as the Wobblies, the IWW, the International Workers of the World, and they were members of the U.S. Communist Party. The Wobblies were the most extreme of all of the unions, and there's like this line between I'm a union worker, but also like I'm a socialist, and then kind of this communist all kind of gets rolled together. And people who even aren't Wobblies sometimes were IWW and unions. They're all the same. They're all communists. Regardless of politics, the 1920s saw a large number of labor strikes from all the pent-up frustrations of the labor years, of the war years. Subpoint B. In 1919, that same year, the Boston police got really upset over their pay. Boston police hadn't seen a wage increase since before World War I, but they had been living through all of the time of like the cost of living and housing and food going up all the time as the war years. So that means that while their wages don't change, they're not receiving any more money, all of their cost of living was going up. That's called real wages, and Boston police officers found that their real wages had declined. While representatives asked for a raise, the representatives then got fired from the police force. And so the police force went on strike for wages and for the right to unionize. Now, the governor of Massachusetts at the time was a guy named Calvin Coolidge, who will be really important to us later in this unit. Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge says, no. You can't, like if you're a police officer, you can't strike against public safety. And so he fired them all and ended the strike by calling in the National Guard to go replace them, saying there's no right to strike against public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. Replacing the strikers with brand new policemen, Coolidge was hailed as Boston's savior and America's best defense against anarchy and communism. In 1921, Coolidge actually rose to power as Warren G. Harding's vice presidential running mate. Subpoint C. Also in 1919, that same year, also in 1919, steel mill workers went on strike for shorter working hours and a living wage. They basically said steel workers were more or less in the same position as the cops were, and they also wanted to go on strike. They wanted a collective union and the rights to, they wanted a union rights and the right to collective bargaining. Collective bargaining, this is an important term. We'll find this is used in a lot of labor negotiations, like, Major League Baseball players also use collective bargaining. It's when workers agree to act together to negotiate their working conditions and their pay. But it also means that while they're all going to work together to negotiate this, they will all accept the same contract. That doesn't mean they're all going to get paid the same amount of money. There could still be like pay scales and where people rate based on their performance and their tenure or whatever else it is. But they all agree to the same terms of employment. That's collective bargaining. It simplifies the negotiations for the workers. It simplifies the negotiations for the employers, although it sometimes means that both sides end up feeling pretty unsatisfied with the result. At first, the U.S. Steel Corporation refused to meet with union representatives, saying, no, we're not really going to negotiate on this. And over 300,000 workers walked off the job saying, well, if you don't agree to our terms, then I guess we're going to walk off the job. And they just went quitsies all at once. Steel companies hired strike. They didn't go quitsies. They went on strike. But steel mill workers, like steel mill employers, went and hired people to go take their jobs and to go break the union strikes as best they could. They hired strike breakers to force employees back to work. The workers also ended up being beaten by police and federal troops and state militias and basically using the power of the government to go break the will of the strikers to do so. The strike ended in 1923. That's almost 4 years later. In 1923, when a report on bad working conditions shocked the public and they said, oh, that's what they've been striking about? Yeah, that's legit. And it led to employers agreeing to an 8-hour workday and backing down from their tough demands. Subpoint D. Unionism was far more effective in some industries than others. And here let's turn towards coal mining. In 1919, that same year, in 1919, John Lewis became the head of the United Mine Workers of America. Under his leadership, coal miners led a 1919 strike against poor working conditions and their really long workdays. When the courts demanded the miners return to work, John Lewis publicly said, okay, well, the court said go back to work, strike's over, everybody back into the mines, but privately told all of the workers, hey, defy the court orders, stick it to the man, don't go back to work, and continue striking. In defiance of the court order, strikers continued on for another month. President Wilson appointed an arbitrating judge to go in the dispute, basically saying like, oh, okay, so the court order didn't work, let's bring in a new judge and we'll get to arbitration and go discuss our way to the end. And the result was a real pay wage raise for workers, a 27% raise. They didn't achieve the shorter workday that they wanted, and they didn't achieve a 5-hour work week until the 1930s. However, John Lewis was seen as a national hero because a 27% raise ain't nothing. Subpoint E. Despite a few notable gains, though, the labor movement overall in the 1920s took some pretty important steps back. Union membership dropped from 5 million members to around 3.5 million members, a 1.5% million person drop. That's an important drop. New immigrants, what happened was basically new immigrants were coming and they were willing to accept poor conditions and lower pay because it was better than the countries they were leaving. Immigrants from various countries, they had no common language, they had no common ties. They basically show up and everybody's like an independent worker, an independent contractor, and that prevented the unions from getting their feet in there. That also meant that the employers are hiring all these people that don't really have labor union protections. And so, basically kind of, I don't want to say it exploits their labor, but it kind of smells like exploited labor. Subpoint C, or little c, farmers who moved to the cities during this period of urbanization, they were, farmers are used to working by themselves, and farmers are used to working really long hours and really hard jobs. So if they move from the country into the cities, farmers said, well, why would I join a union? I'm used to working hard, and I'm not, labor unions don't have much appeal to people who are working by themselves all the time. So they just plain didn't see the value in unionizing. And most unions excluded African Americans, and that certainly limited their numbers as well. By the end of the decade, less than 1% of black people had union membership, whereas 3% of white people were unionized. A lot of notable labor unions did have black membership, but overall union membership was declining for everybody across the board. Roman numeral number 3. Beginning in the 1920s, New York had a lot of people, had 5.6 million people. Chicago, less so, but still a lot, at 3 million. Philadelphia had around 2 million people. They were the most important cities in the country. 65 other cities, though, still had over 100,000 and were some pretty important urban areas. In the 1920 census, 51.2% of Americans were in communities of 25,000 or more. But from 1922 to 1929, nearly 2 million people every year were leaving farms to go move into bigger cities. In the 1920s, we see a transition between rural and urban life, where people are moving off the farms and into the cities. This is kind of the tipping point in America when we really become an urban nation. U.S. farming had gone mostly unchanged since the 19th century. Small towns were offering close ties and hard work and the consistency of conservative morals. But by contrast, cities were full of big anonymous crowds and money-making opportunities and urban crime and opportunities for recreation like drinking and gambling and casual dating and all the things that were pretty shocking to Americans who were brand new to city life. And that brings us to subpoint B. The biggest clash between rural and urban life was over the role of alcohol. In January of 1920, the 18th Amendment passed, and it launched the Prohibition era, making the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol illegal. During Prohibition, consuming alcohol was not illegal. If a person had it already, they could consume it legally, but producing it, buying it, or moving it was illegal. The amendment was supported, the 18th Amendment was supported by religious groups, notably a group known as the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and people in the rural South and the West, but mostly Protestant regions without many European immigrants. They were the ones that were the strongest Prohibition voices. Supporters of Prohibition considered alcohol to be really one of the main causes of corruption. Drunkenness led to domestic abuse and crime and accidents and other serious social problems. But for most of the year, but nevertheless, the 18th Amendment passes. And that first year, in 1920, the country really did try hard to make Prohibition work. But the war and the turmoil of post-war life really just kind of made people sick of making sacrifices over and over again. But really, Prohibition was probably doomed because the U.S. government didn't budget enough money to enforce the law. The Volstead Act had established the Prohibition Bureau of the Treasury Department in 1919, but the job of border enforcement, tracking down illegal distilleries in the interior of the country, monitoring the illegal trafficking of alcohol, and overseeing few industries that were making legal alcohol, because there were some legal alcohol that was being made, they just had 1,500 poorly funded federal agents, and this was a totally impossible task. Subpoint C. In cities and urban areas, hidden saloons and nightclubs known as speakeasies became very fashionable. They were there they were called speakeasies because people were supposed to talk quietly, talk easy when they were there to avoid being caught. Speakeasies could be anywhere. They could be in offices or cellars or penthouses or tea rooms or hardware stores. They were hidden. They were guarded with a password. It's kind of like what you see in the movies. They were patronized by middle and upper class men and middle and upper class women. People trying to get around alcohol laws sometimes decided to go distill their own liquor. Since alcohol was allowed for medicinal purposes and for religious use, people bought prescription alcohol and sacramental wine for their own use. Though attendance at religious services rose measurably but modestly in 1920s, sacramental wine production increased dramatically. It sure looked like a lot of people got religion at home. And 800,000 gallons by 1925, it was a pretty huge number. Doctors made an estimated $40 million by writing fake prescriptions for whiskey because alcohol is a chemical solution and it can be used in medicine production. And whiskey by prescription? A little dicey maybe on that one. Bootleggers smuggled alcohol from surrounding countries, mainly from Canada and from Cuba and islands around the Caribbean, and then sold that booze on the black market. And that brings us to subpoint D. Prohibition encouraged people to disrespect the law, and it contributed to organized crime in major cities. The most famous leader of organized crime in the United States was a guy named Al Capone. Al Capone controlled the Chicago liquor business by essentially killing his competitors. His gang was tied to 522 Chicago area killings, but Capone, in a lot of people's eyes, was seen as a public hero and a renegade and a Robin Hood against a corrupt law. By the mid-1920s, and only 19% of Americans supported prohibition. Most others wanted the amendment either changed or repealed altogether, believing that the effects were bigger. Basically, the result of the prohibition brought out bigger problems than the alcohol itself did. Still, the 18th Amendment persisted in force until 1933, when it was formally repealed by the 21st Amendment. That change of this year from the 1920s, from the post-war turmoil to the roaring 20s, is a big story, and it's fascinating, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.